Once again, this is the third part of a three-part series sponsored by Wausau Metro Strong. We want to first and all thank North Central Technical College for providing this wonderful space for us, free of charge. It's a wonderful community service that they do. I want to talk a little bit about Wausau Metro Strong, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation. So Wausau Metro Strong's mission is committed to building a safe community for all. The pillars of this volunteer group are to unify, prepare, support, inform, and educate those in our community. It was developed after the March 22nd shootings, where we tragically lost 4 community members. There are approximately 70 members in Wausau Metro Strong from all different walks of life, and there are 5 different committees. There's the executive committee, the business committee, the legal committee, domestic abuse, and communication. If anyone here would like to join Wausau Metro Strong, we are always looking for more members. Please feel free to contact me about that, or Brian Gumness is on the executive committee. He's here today as well. And Jane Graham Jennings is on the domestic violence committee. You can contact her as well. So these are some of the member organizations. This is all in your PowerPoint in front of you. So let's just recap. We've been trying to do a variety of different community education. September 4th was talking about companies and businesses' emergency action and business continuity plans for if there were to be some kind of tragic thing occur at a business. October 30th presentation was the first of our 3-part series on domestic violence, understanding what it is, which is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors, including physical, sexual, psychological, economic threats, coercion that adults or adolescents use against their intimate partners. We talked about the link between mass shootings and domestic violence. 57% of mass shootings, the shooter has targeted a family member or an intimate partner. Many people don't know that. And then we reviewed the 7 reasons employers should address domestic violence. I want to also mention at the very end of your PowerPoint that you have in front of you is a link to the community access, public access channel that you can view any of the presentations if you missed them. Because we're just going to, very broad-based go over the previous presentations.
So when we did our December 4th presentation, we're really trying to give some context around why domestic violence is critically important for all of us to understand, and particularly for employers to have policies and understandings about how they can best support people that are in their employ that are victims, which statistically I can tell you, you know someone who is a victim of abuse. Whether you know that, or don't know, you know someone. It is very common, it happens all the time. We talk about the continuum of abuse when we're discussing it. It's not only physical, psychological and financial abuse have long-lasting effects that affect you as employers, that affect your employees. We also want you to know and understand about it because people who choose to use power and control are also in your employ. You work with people who are abusive to their intimate partners, and we want you to understand how you can help address that, what you as an employer can do for accountability, and how you can partner with our community partners to keep people safe and to make sure we can provide some incentive for abusive people to alter their behaviors. So those are the things we covered on the 4th, and we will get into that in more depth today.
So here's the title of our presentation, Why It's Important for Me, My Business, and My Employees to Know About Domestic Violence, Session 3 of 3. This is Jane Graham Jennings. I'll let her tell you a little bit about herself.
So my history is really all in this trajectory, really dealing with trauma in intimate partner relationships, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking. That has been my entire career. So I have been with the women's community 24 years, and I have been director for over 20 years. Working with our community to help raise awareness, to help people really understand the complexities about these things. Through the Department of Justice, I am a certified law enforcement trainer. So I train law enforcement recruits and officers on understanding the dynamics of investigating domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and trafficking crimes because they're very closely linked. I work with the Criminal Justice Council on the state as well, and I serve as an expert witness across the state. Expert witnesses are needed around the state in understanding this because, again, our main point is we want people to have a better grasp of these issues, because working with it every day, I can see things in ways that people who don't quite understand. Jurors don't understand these dynamics either, so the traits that are quite common for victims enduring abuse seem that they don't make sense to the general public. So as expert witnesses, we can talk to and help educate the juries to understand why victims recant, why victims change their story, why victims lie, why victims stop engaging in the criminal justice system. It's not because they are at fault, but it's because of all the dynamics that exist. Because it's so complex and confusing, both Lee and I travel around the state. We're asked to provide expert witness testimony in domestic violence, sexual assault cases around the state, again, to educate. That's our main goal.
And I'm Lee Shipway. I'm the Executive Director of Peaceful Solutions Counseling. I'm a licensed mental health therapist. Specifically, my license is a licensed clinical social worker. Have been practicing mental health in the Wausau community for the last 37 years. Spent about 25 years of my career at Children's Service Society, where I provided individual counseling, couples counseling, family therapy, and spent a large part of my career there providing domestic violence abusers treatment for something called the SAFE program, Stopping Abuse for Everyone, as well as providing services for victims of domestic violence and survivors of childhood sexual assault. So I've worked with kids all the way down to age 3, up through age 18, and then adult survivors of incest. As Jane said, I'm also an expert witness for domestic violence cases and child sexual abuse cases, trying to help jurors understand the dynamics of that, why people maybe don't report or recant after reporting or delay in reporting. So we're just going to review a little bit, a short summary of session 2 for those of you that weren't here, or maybe if you were, it doesn't hurt to have a review of that as well.
Something that we always want to keep in mind whenever we're doing something with Wausau Metro Strong is the reason that we're here. Because March 22nd, a domestic violence perpetrator believed that he had the right to hurt other people because his wife was not doing what he wanted. And that's what we're talking about, people who believe they are entitled to hurt other human beings, and we need to stop that from happening. The entire situation that occurred when we lost 4 of our community members was based in domestic abuse. We lost 2 co-workers of the victim who were saving her life when her husband tried to come and kill her at her place of employment. Diane and Karen put themselves in harm's way to ensure that that woman could be safe. Sarah was the victim's attorney who was providing support to her and helping her in that case. Her husband did not like that someone was helping her have her rights heard and met, and decided that he should take her life. And then Officer Weiland was killed in the line of duty surrounding the scene when the perpetrator was barricaded in his home. So this is where it comes from, and in the domestic abuse world, we always want to take a minute to make sure we recognize what's happening and to never forget the people that we lose to this preventable crime. So that's why Wausau Metro Strong exists.
So last time we talked about the mandatory arrest law, which was instituted in Wisconsin in 1987. It says that law enforcement shall make an arrest when there's probable cause that a crime has been committed. Previous to that, officers used to have discretion and decide whether or not they would make an arrest. Many states had realized that that was not helping because it just allowed the abuser to keep on being abusive, and so mandatory arrest was enacted.
And there are some very specific things that happen in our statute, so it's not just, law enforcement has a very difficult job in trying to figure out all the dynamics that are occurring in those situations. So the legislator gave them some specific tools of things that they are to use in their investigations to determine what's really happening in that household, because it doesn't always look what's really happening doesn't always show itself, and so officers have to have a very difficult job of determining what's happening in that household when victims are afraid to be honest, when victims say nothing happened even though there's visible signs that something did in fact happen, and so officers are given tools to try and figure all of that out to ensure that they are arresting the person who is the predominant aggressor in that household and not arresting victims.
So the power and control is something that we use very often in the domestic violence field to help people understand the dynamics of domestic violence within an intimate partner relationship. You'll see on the big black band on the outside, it says physical, sexual violence in the middle, meaning it can be physical violence or sexual violence. Oftentimes there is sexual violence occurring within intimate partner relationships. Women are forced to have sex with their husbands or their boyfriends, and people don't often think of that as domestic violence, but it absolutely is. Once an act of violence has occurred, the balance of power shifts in that relationship, where the abuser has more power than the victim. And one of the ways that he keeps that power over the other person is by using the inside parts of the wheel. So each different piece of the pie, if you will, is a different controlling tactic. So I want to make this clear that it's a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior that happens over a period of time. It's not a one isolated incident out of 20 years or 30 years. Someone who is an abuser uses these tactics on a regular basis to try to keep control over their partner. You want to add to that? The cycle of violence we talked about last time, and I redrew this just a little bit to give us more room so that you can see this better. Oftentimes you'll see this in a circle. I like this one better, and I'll tell you why on the next slide. So we have the escalation phase, we have the violence phase, and then we have the honeymoon phase. What happens in the escalation phase is that the abuser is feeling inadequate, feeling insecure. Tensions are building because of that. Most of the men in my program have very low self-esteem, they feel inadequate, and they just have hyper-vigilant about someone pointing that out to them or somehow being embarrassed. And so their partners oftentimes, they see them as an extension of themselves. And if she does something or says something that he thinks is bad, he thinks it makes him look bad. So imagine living day to day, trying to be hyper-vigilant about that. It just increases a lot of escalation. During the escalation phase, sometimes what's going on is the verbal abuse, where he's being verbally abusive to her, calling her names, putting her down, really trying to make her feel less than. It then gets to the point where violence happens, and that is a choice to strike out as a way to control her and control the situation. Oftentimes people look at this bell-shaped curve and go, oh, I get it, Lee. When we get to the top of the scale, it's like they just blow and they lose it and they can't control themselves. And wrong answer. That is not what this is about at all. They are absolutely in control. They are choosing when to be abusive and when not to be abusive. By using that violence, he then instills fear inside of her, which is that imbalance of power that I talked about a minute ago. And because he has that power over her and she's afraid of him, it makes it that much easier to control her. So after he's used physical violence, he maybe only has to use physical violence one time. Then he can use the isolation, the male privilege, the minimizing, denying, and blaming, intimidation, coercion, and threats. Once someone has scared you enough, all they have to do is give you a dirty look to keep you in line, or smash their fist down, or threaten to take the kids. So all of those behaviors on the inside is what kind of keeps the whole dynamic and pattern going. Now, what happens after the violence phase is what we call the honeymoon phase. And this is where afterwards he feels, I'm going to give you two different scenarios. One where a person does have a conscience. The abuser feels badly for what he's done. He apologizes, promises he won't do it again, treats her like a queen, takes her out to dinner, buys her that favorite dress she's been looking for, cleans up the garage, does anything that he thinks is going to get him back in her good graces. Because again, he fears losing her. That's the biggest fear of most abusers, is that they're going to lose their partner. Because deep down inside, they don't feel like they're good enough. So they feel like any other guy is going to look better to her than him. So he has to try to keep her like a bird in a cage. So in that honeymoon phase, think how great that feels to have somebody waiting on you hand and foot, telling you you're beautiful, doing everything you want. It's like that courtship phase when you're dating someone, you have those little butterflies in your stomach. That honeymoon phase is really what kind of hooks her back in a lot of times, because she doesn't want to believe that the man she loves is abusive to her. So she ignores that push or that shove or that slap or that punch, thinking that somehow it's an isolated event. So we're going to move on from that and things are going to get better. That eternal hope that things will be better. However, this is typically what happens over time. Here's our first violent episode. The honeymoon phase occurs and the tension and escalation goes down, but then it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. Makes it that much easier to get to the top of the scale, or if not higher. And then the next time, it goes even higher, and next time after that, to the point where it gets to be a flat line. This might be a person's life over a year. It could be over 3 years, it could be over 10 years, it could be over 20 years. What I find with abusers is the pattern goes one of two ways. Either the violence gets more frequent and more severe, as in the first time it was just a push. The second time it's a slap. The third time it's a punch. The fourth time it's an actual beating. More and more violence as time goes on. And there's less and less time of that honeymoon in between. At that point, she's probably feeling stuck for a lot of different reasons, that she feels like she cannot escape the abuse and escape the relationship. Or, I've seen it go this way, where there's one incident of violence and no more violence after that because he scared her enough that all he has to do is give her that dirty look or threaten her. So all these episodes after that are verbal abuse, emotional abuse, threats and coercion, to the point where it gets to be a flat line, as in she doesn't even believe him anymore when he says, I won't do this again. He doesn't even believe himself when he promises not to hurt her again. And it's like the relationship is dead. There just really aren't even any feelings anymore for each other. Anyone want to add to that?
I think, real quick, we forgot to kind of make a disclaimer at the beginning. So you are going to hear pretty gendered language that we're talking about, and this is simply because this is statistically how we experience the problem of domestic violence. It disproportionately affects women, disproportionately men perpetuate it. That being said, we have to recognize that there are men who are victims of abuse by female perpetrators. There are very similar tactics, but also some very unique things that exist within those relationships. We also have to recognize that same gender relationships also have power and control issues in them. So whether it is two women and one of them is violent to their partner, or two men and one of them is violent to their partner, those are some unique things as well. Those are completely like a whole other topic to discuss because there are unique aspects of those particular relationships. But please bear in mind, it can happen to anyone. Disproportionately, women are victims. It is a gender-based crime, so you will hear very gendered language. But clearly, men can be victims as well.
So just to give you a little data on that, the SAFE program at Peaceful Solutions Counseling, we treat about 250 people in that program a year. Of the 250, about 25 are females. I happen to be the person who does the assessments for women that are arrested and court ordered to our program. I would say 9 out of 10 of them are victims, that they've either retaliated, they've fought back, or it was self-defense and the officer couldn't quite discern that it was self-defense and was court ordered. So in my world of 33 years of providing batters treatment, it is by large and far, it is men perpetrating against women. As Jane said, it can be the other way around, but I just want you to know that's why I use he when I talk about abusers, because that's my experience, my professional experience in doing that program.
So really when we're talking about things that are happening in response to domestic violence, being in love with someone who is intentionally manipulating and hurting you is very traumatic. The psychological effects of that are severe, and the recovery from that takes quite some time. So we try to talk about this in terms of trauma, because what is happening to someone who is being held captive by someone that they love is very traumatic and changes the brain chemistry of people who are experiencing this abuse. So when we're dealing with people who are victims of abuse, and when you have them at your places of employment, the responses that you see are pretty normal trauma responses. They have a fight, flight, or freeze response. They have often a loss of memory, and because of the ongoing chemical changes that are actually occurring as a result of the abuse that they're experiencing, oftentimes they lose their executive functioning, which means they can't actually make a decision. Literally, they do not have access to that part of their brain. They are living solely in the survival parts of their brain. So something that you would be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that? Didn't you think about that? What were you thinking? They literally cannot think. So they don't have access to that because of the way trauma affects the brain. So that's also important for us to understand when we're looking at the behaviors of someone and like, that doesn't make any sense. It might not. And it might be because that person is living solely in the part of their brain that's survival, and that's all they have access to.
So when you're living in that survival brain, there's all kinds of chemicals that are being flooded into your body that causes that executive functioning to not work. And that doesn't just happen at home, it's going to happen at their workplace. So one of the clues that you might see with an employee is that they've been functioning well and then all of a sudden they're not functioning. Like they can't make decisions or they're making mistakes that they didn't used to make. That can be one of the signs. So what can companies do to help? Corporate leaders are very important. They can help alter the path of domestic violence and reverse the negative toll it takes on our workforce. It's very, very important that from the top down, that an organization, a business, a community says we are not going to tolerate domestic violence, and we're going to do that by supporting victims in any way that we can and by holding the abuser accountable for his or her actions. So many times in our society, we hold victims accountable for what's happened to them. Well, she shouldn't have done that, or she shouldn't have said that, or why did she go there? Shouldn't she have known? We need to stop that and start making sure that we're holding the abuser accountable. So here are some, we're going to give you lots of different strategies throughout the day on what you can do to help within your workplace. One is make brochures about domestic violence. Have resources easily available to employees, especially in private places such as women's restrooms or men's restrooms. I remember years ago when I started in this business, there were little tiny cards that the women's community gave to physicians' offices and gave to businesses. And at first I thought, well, why is it so teeny? And one of the victim advocates explained to me, because she needs to be able to tuck it in her sock or put it in underneath her sock on her shoe so she can hide that so that the abuser doesn't have access to that. So, and I know that's a different world than what you all live in, but we need to think about that in terms of how sneaky people have to be in order to be safe. Businesses can display posters which convey messages about the unacceptability of domestic violence, saying that it's not acceptable. We have a zero tolerance policy. We have a wonderful poster that we have at my office. I was going to bring it and I forgot. It shows a little boy very up close, like this with his hands crossed, and he doesn't have a shirt on. He's probably 8 years old, maybe 7 years old. And underneath it, the caption says, domestic violence doesn't just affect the adults in the relationship. And we keep that in our room where we do the groups, because I want the men to understand that full impact is not just on you or your partner, but especially it's on your children. Another one is allow employees to transfer sick time or vacation time to each other to help respond to domestic violence situations if a victim needs extra days off for a variety of reasons. More strategies. Use employee newsletters to discuss domestic violence and the community resources that are available. There's a 211 guide through the United Way, the Give and Get Help guide that has all kinds of resources. If you don't have any of those, contact the United Way. They are free for you to take and have those at your offices. At the end of the slideshow, there's contact information for the women's community as well as Peaceful Solutions Counseling. Really, those are the two agencies in town that are the experts in domestic violence. So we should be your go-to people. Please reach out to us. Number 2, send letters, brochures, or payroll check inserts, if anybody still does payroll check inserts, to the homes of employees, inviting those who want to help with domestic violence to contact company counselors, who want help with it to contact company counselors or EAP counselors. Third one, provide managers, personnel staff, shop stewards, and company nurses with training in identifying signs of domestic violence and how to direct workers to employee assistance programs or community resources. Managers, shop stewards, foremen, nurses are the people who are going to be your eyes and ears, and they're the ones that are going to maybe know that there maybe is something that's a little off, but there's something going on. You need to give them the resources to help with that.
And the overall capture of those 2 previous slides of the strategies is talk about it. Silence is what enables abuse to continue. Historically, we said we don't want to get involved because that's a family matter. We're involved. Every one of us in this community is affected. So when we normalize a conversation, when we help create spaces where victims don't feel like they should be ashamed, when we normalize a conversation and say that behavior is not appropriate and hold perpetrators accountable, then we create a safe environment where we can all live and not worry about our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers being hurt. But we have to talk about it. It can be very uncomfortable for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it hits so close to home. When we go to work, we want to pretend like we're not living that life in our house. Work for us is our escape. Denial is a very effective coping mechanism, and it lets us be safe psychologically so we can pretend that that's not happening. So sometimes people don't want to bring domestic violence conversations to their work because they are living it, and they don't want anyone to know. It can be very uncomfortable because you are working with people who use power and control. So we make excuses for that. If we bring it here, then I'm going to have to recognize and accept that this person who is my coworker, my partner, my friend, is using power and control, is an abusive person. And I don't want to accept that. It's very hard to talk about all these things because people who are perpetrating these crimes are people that we know and work with. So we have to bring it out into the open as a discussion. And I was doing a presentation yesterday about it and really talked about kind of the transformation in our industry of anti-domestic violence work, where we changed the way we talk about people who use power and control. Early on, 30 years ago, we demonized. They're bad people. You forget about them, lock them up, and throw away the key. Well, that's not effective. It's failed us because they are people. They are humans who are behaving badly. So we particularly change our language and we focus on the behavior, not the person. If we want to believe that abuse is going to stop, we have to believe that abusive people will change their behavior. And for those who won't, that's why we have a legal system, and eventually, hopefully, they will be locked up and not have access to people. We're not there yet. So for people who are just lost, the abusive people who are so insecure and they're just like tiny hurting children inside, we need to hold them accountable, but also recognize their humanity and help them get the support they need to change their behavior. It's particularly important with kids. So when kids come into our program, we have to make sure we're not saying anything bad about either parent. When they talk about why they're there and they're afraid, we talk about the behavior of daddy. What daddy is doing is not okay. Daddy's not a bad person, but you can't behave that way. So we're going to help daddy change the way he behaves. So we really have to be cognizant of how we put that language. They're not monsters. They are injured people who need to be accountable for their choice and actions, but who also need help to change those choice and actions. So all of these things that are strategies, the first thing is get it out in the open. Make it part of your normal conversation in your work environment. Posters that say, this behavior is not okay. Here's where you can get help. That's where we can start the conversations.
Absolutely. So even some more strategies. Offer lunchtime workshops dealing with domestic violence. And this is a nice thing to think about. If you focus the conversation on how kids are impacted, it removes it one step, so that if there's a woman there or a man there who is a victim, focusing on their kids is sometimes easier, like Jane said, than having to focus on me and the impact. But it still gets the information to them. It still gets the knowledge to them. Especially with abusers. We spend a lot of time in our program talking about the impact of this on their children. If they can't change for them or for their partner, sometimes that's when I see the light bulb come on, is when we start talking about the impact on their kids. And then they realize, oh, I need to do something different than what I've been doing. Second one is adopt formal or informal personnel policies which are responsive to the needs of employees who experience domestic violence. And we'll talk about these more in detail in a little bit. Strengthen security measures to screen building access for non-employees. Provide intra-departmental transfers for safety reasons, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Impose disciplinary sanctions for batterers or abusers. I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. When their behavior involves the use of company time, company telephones, or vehicles to harass the victim. Oftentimes people at companies feel like, well, it's between the employee and her partner. I can't get involved in that. Yes, you can and should when it's involving company resources. Want to talk about that?
Yes. Are there
the
victims
answer is
or perpetrators? Yes, there are both. And again, it's about bringing this to the forefront. So anyone can be a victim, and if we create environments where we allow victims to disclose without feeling ashamed, we still put a tremendous amount of responsibility on victims to stop the abusive behavior. they cannot. If they could, they would stop it. So one of the things that is pretty common in our world for victims, they appear unemployable because it is a very strategic maneuver by their abusive partner to repeatedly show up at the victim's place of employment. And it usually plays out that the employer says, you have to tell him to stop coming here or I'm going to have to let you go, which is exactly what the abuser wants. It plays right into the hands of the manipulation, because if a victim could control the behavior, we wouldn't have a problem. Victim's not in control of that, but we put all the responsibility on that victim. So what can an employer do? Someone's coming to your place of employment and harassing people. You have the authority to tell them, get off of this property. If you come here again, I will call the police. You don't even have to involve their partner in any way. You don't have to ask their partner to come and talk to them. You don't have to do anything. You have the authority for your place of business to say, leave. You are making employees here uncomfortable. If you come back, I will call the police. You have the power to do that. Victims do not.
Likewise, anyone can be an abuser. I have had physicians in my group. I've had police officers in my group. I've had school principals and teachers in my group. I've had lawyers in my group. I think a lot of times when we talk about domestic violence, and I tell people what I do for a living, they automatically assume I'm working with all the factory guys. It's all blue collar. Absolutely not. It goes from blue collar all the way to the tippy top of white collar. Power and control does not know an economic boundary. It is among all different types of people. And that makes it difficult because sometimes the abusers are so adept at putting on a front and looking very different at the workplace than they are at home, that oftentimes when you discover that that's going on, this is what people say to me, oh, I would have never guessed that he did. This guy, of all the guys, there's no way I would guess that. Well, it's not like they walk around with an A on their head for abuser. It's very easy for them to put up a different front. So one of the things I really hope you walk away with today is feeling more comfortable speaking up and saying something, because what we say to a victim makes a huge difference. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have been in the grocery store or I've been in a parking lot somewhere and a former client comes up to me that I maybe saw 15 years ago or 20 years ago and says, you know, Lee, when you said that one thing to me, that made such a difference. And it's like, I don't even remember saying it, but when I hear it, I'm like, that sounds like something I'd say. Don't forget the impact of just saying to someone, I'm worried about you. I'm concerned about you. What can I do to help? I'm worried for your children. This is not going to get better without intervention. Little sentences like that, because you have to remember, they're being brainwashed. Everything that they're taking in is what he's telling them and what he's feeding to her. And so when an outside source says, this is scary, I'm afraid for you, it's kind of like a wake-up call, like, well, because they're used to living in it from day to day to day, that it almost seems normal. I know that seems odd, but it almost seems normal. So when an outside person says, this is a problem, this is scary, it helps them see it from a different perspective.
Some particular things that you can do. So most importantly, you want to listen. Victims know best what their needs are. They're trying to figure it out, so listen to what they're saying. It's not always, it's easy for us to offer advice when we don't have to live the consequences of those choices. So it's really easy for me to tell someone what to do, but I get to go home to a really safe environment where I'm not afraid. My choices are much different. So for someone living in an abusive relationship, what I think makes a lot of sense might actually not be safe for them. So the most important thing to do is give them space to breathe. Listen to what they say without offering your thoughts on, well, if that were me, I would, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not you. So we need to hear what they have to say. Always give the clear message that you don't deserve this. Because a lot of times, depending on where they are in their recovery, victims will say, if I would have done X, Y, or Z, this wouldn't have happened. I should have done blah, blah, blah. They take it all on and they think that they're responsible for the behavior. So just say, you know what? That's not okay. Whatever you did, I get, but I don't think it's okay for someone to hurt you no matter what you did. clear messages that are consistent. Listen to them and take them seriously. Let them know that you want to help in any way you can, and offer that I'll be there for you. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. How can I help you? Help them with safety planning. So this is a resource in the Wausau community in Marathon County. Folks from the women's community can come and talk to your leadership team, your management teams, your employees about safety planning. We can help you do that. If you're working with an employee and you're like, I'm not really sure what to do, you can call us and we can help you walk through what's safe and what's not safe, because there are a whole lot of variables that exist that we can help you kind of maneuver around. And also focus on the partner's behavior. Again, because as soon as we say something negative about their partner, their defenses kick in. And the harder they're going to fight to prove that their partner's not bad. So we never talk about, call them names, whenever, they're useless anyway. We just say, what he's doing is not okay. I'm sure there's a lot of times he's really great, but this behavior, that's not okay. Focus on the behavior, not the person.
So do use supportive, direct statements. Sometimes people feel uncomfortable with that and they want to beat around the bush. It's much better to just be direct about it. I'm seeing this behavior. I'm worried about you. I'm concerned. Are you feeling safe? What can we do to help? Because then she's going to realize, oh, this person is really willing to talk about it, instead of turning away or being embarrassed and like changing the subject. Do provide community resources like we talked about earlier. Respect that person's confidentiality. Just because they've opened up to you doesn't mean that you can talk to your other coworkers about it. Do not do that. If it's an abuser that's in your workplace, let that person know that they cannot use company time or resources to engage in domestic abuse. Don't tell a victim what to do. Don't tell her that she should leave. Don't tell her not to leave. Again, she's been living with this and she knows his pattern. She knows his cycle better than anybody. And so she's going to know when it's safe and when it's not to exit the relationship, or even if it is possible to exit the relationship and not be killed. Most people don't realize the most dangerous time for a battered woman is after she leaves the relationship. 70-some% of the time when victims are killed, it's after they've left. Much like the shooting on March 22nd here. Don't tell a victim to go back and try a little harder. Unfortunately, I have had way too many conversations with people of the faith community over the last 30 years where they would tell the victim, he's just acting in the flesh. You need to go back and you need to be a good wife and you need to try harder. Luckily, I do not hear many of those anymore, but 30 years ago I heard that from more than one minister, priest, you name it, from a variety of different denominations. Don't talk to the abusive partner about it. Victims are often abused further for disclosing the abuse. So if she's confided in you, don't go and talk to him. That's different than if you are actually watching him and you see him do the behavior and you want to address it with him, that would be okay. But if she tells you, you're breaking her confidence and you're making it way more dangerous for her.
Really critically important to not be judgmental. Victims are very used to people questioning their behavior and saying, if that were me, and why do you stay? Why wouldn't you just get out of there? Why would you do that? Why do you let that happen? Why do you accept that? All these questions that victims are trying to figure out in their own mind. Human beings are very rational creatures, and we want things to make sense. And someone you love intentionally manipulating and hurting you doesn't make sense. So victims try to fill in the gaps. The easiest way to do that is to blame themselves, because nothing else makes sense. What could I possibly have done that would have made him do this to me? So they're already questioning all those things about themselves, and when you add on to that, it puts them further into their own responsibility for his behavior. So those judgmental questions, and they may be very well intentioned because you care about someone and you're concerned about them, but from the perspective of someone who's been trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense, those are very judgmental, and it creates an environment in which they don't feel safe to say, I'm experiencing this. So we have to make sure we don't judgment, and even if you're thinking, well, I wouldn't, doesn't matter what you would do. You're not in those shoes. So we need to let them work through figuring it out to the best of their ability. And this can be really hard for people because it's a cycle. Recovery from trauma, recovery from abuse doesn't happen overnight. People think that if a victim would leave the relationship, they would be all fine, their life would be great, everything would be happy, and there would be no more pain. That's not how it works. First of all, again, like Lee said, leaving is extremely dangerous. They really need to think about what's going to happen. When a victim leaves, the power has been broken, the control has been broken. People who want power and control don't like that. For victims who leave, they return. That's what happens. If we expect something different, we're setting them up for failure, and we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. Just think about this. If you have ever been in a relationship, well, how many of you have been in a relationship? Have you ever been in an argument in your intimate relationship? Have you ever said anything mean that you wish you wouldn't have said? And your partner ever said anything nasty and you walked out? Right? You left. You're done. I'm out. Goodbye. Is that how it worked? Not usually. What did you do? You had a conversation. You talked about it. There was an apology. Right? That's how relationships work. So apologies in healthy relationships are things that we need because we get in arguments, we have frustrations, we do things that we wish we wouldn't have. We say, I'm sorry, because we intend to not do it again. Abusive people have a different intention. Their apology is to try to make sure they get their victim back in good graces so that they keep them in their control. It's a very different thing. So victims are maneuvering through what is in a healthy relationship a normal interaction. But it's not healthy. They're trying to make it make sense. So victims leave relationships, they're tired, that's enough, I'm done, and then they think about the good times. And then they think about how they're going to care for their children without their partner. And then they think about how sorry he really is. And then they think about all those things that we all do when we remember the love of a person that we're in love with, right? Hope is extremely effective. It's a driving force. So my hope that my partner is sincere in the apology brings people back all the time. So victims go through this cycle. And it's been researched, actually, and the national research says a victim will leave and return to the same relationships an average of 7 times. So if we think a victim leaves and then everything's happy-go-lucky and they're like, that's not how it works. Victims go home. So when we put judgments on them, when we say, why did you do that? Why did you go back? I wouldn't do that. We have now shut the door on them ever feeling like they're safe to ask a question or to tell you that they're experiencing it again. When folks come to our shelter program and they live with us for a short time, they go home. We know that's what's going to happen. If we've done our job successfully, when they need shelter again, they will feel safe coming back because they know we didn't judge them. Because actually our hope is that when they go home, they don't get hurt again. That's actually our hope. Our job is not to get victims to leave. Our job is to have victims be safe. And we ultimately want community members who don't hurt people they claim to love. So when they walk out our door and they're like, I'm going home, it's going to be good this time, we're like, I'm with you. If it's good, but if it's not. I hope that it is. You think it is. Good for you. You go do you. But if, just please know, you're always welcome back here. So as coworkers, as friends, as employers, know that this is what's going to happen. So that maybe you can help extend your patience and understand this is part of a human being trying to make sense of something that has no sense. They're trying to figure it out. They want to believe their partner's sorry and that they can have their family like it used to be. And I don't fault people for that. That makes a whole lot of sense to me. Why the abusive partner continues to hurt and abuse when they've been given another chance, that has never made sense to me. I'll leave that to the experts. But victims returning isn't frustrating. That's what they're going to do. So don't lose patience with that. Know that that is what will happen, and they're trying to figure it out. And the more support we can provide to them along that path, the easier they'll actually be able to figure out what they need.
And you need to also understand that it's not just the hope factor, that's a very big factor, but for women who don't have as many economic resources, there are a lot of barriers to her being able to leave the relationship. So maybe she realizes that he is abusive, it's not getting better, it's not going to get better. She tries to leave, and then they only had one car because he wouldn't let her have a car, so she has no transportation. She doesn't have the education that she wished she had in order to get a better job because he wouldn't let her go back to school. Or the children are begging her, Mommy, can we please go back? We miss Daddy. Or she's getting pressure from her family that she's being a bad wife by doing this, or his family, or her own religious beliefs. There's lots of barriers that keep women from being able to leave even when they want to leave. And I think that's another reason why they leave so many times and come back, is because they think they can make it, and then there's a barrier to them being able to be independent on their own. And then that's when we need to look at what does the community need to do in terms of resources to help shore her up so that she has everything she needs. All right, let's talk about human resources and administration management tools. Providing protective services is very important. Security personnel to walk employees to their cars is something that would be very helpful. To screen people at entries is helpful. Consider monitoring work sites with security cameras. Now I know some big companies maybe have the ability to do that, small companies don't. We're just going to put everything out here, and you can kind of look at the menu and see what you can and can't do. Offer to relocate a threatened employee to another work site or another location within the site. That can make a huge difference. Offer to alter an employee's work schedule to make the schedule less predictable to the abuser. Ooh, should have got a little space in there. To the abuser, it should say. Because again, these guys sometimes are like tracking her every move and know exactly where she is at what time of day. So trying to make that more or less predictable can make her safer. Provide silent alarms or buzzers at workstations for employees who need them. And allow employees time off to address safety needs. Encourage victims to provide a photo of the abuser so those in the screening positions can help provide protection. Encourage the use of existing resources such as law enforcement. I think a lot of times people don't want to call law enforcement because they're like, well, we don't want to bother them, or we don't know if this rises to the occasion. Always call. When in doubt, call. Chief Ben Bliven is with us today, and I've had the pleasure of doing some workshops with him, and he always tells people, when in doubt, call. Right, Ben?
Yes, absolutely. We never bother to law enforcement. We would much rather be involved in discussions on the front end and help navigate whatever situation is going on. Much easier on the front end to call. We want to be of service and of assistance to you. So it's never a bother for you to call us, and we want to be helpful to you and help answer your questions. These are complex situations, some of which we may have navigated before. We have a wide network of resources, like the ladies up front, that we can bring in for assistance as well. So please call.
So another thing to think about in looking at your organization policies, do you have a policy on domestic abuse? And really that is for any employee that you have, and what it does is offer a clear message to every person who you hire that you take domestic abuse very seriously, and you would provide specific supports and resources for people who identify as a victim of abuse. The policy should also consider accountability for people who use violence while on work time or using agency time. So there are a number of different examples that you can find. We can assist you if you're looking for specific examples. Either Lee or I can help you. Last in session 2, the women's community passed out our organization policy on domestic abuse. So understanding that victims, even victim advocates, can be victims of abuse. No one is immune. So we have a policy specific to how we would provide supports and what we would do for someone who is identified as a victim. Part of that included in your policy really, again, is around the confidentiality, because if people feel like when they disclose to their supervisor that it's going to be shared with all the other employees, they're less likely to discuss that with you. So in your policies, it should state who specifically would be informed about that, and that might vary depending on what your place of employment is. So that's something you would work out with your leadership team or your HR department on what safety measures you can put in place in your policies, and who would be a need to know if someone discloses to you. We talk to victims, we try to see if they work in an environment that they feel safe enough to disclose, particularly for people who have restraining orders, because we want other people at the organization to have their eyes open, because if that individual comes there, anyone can contact law enforcement if there's a violation of a restraining order, and it's a must arrest. And we'll talk a little bit later about restraining orders. But there are some very different things you can have in your policies, and again, we would be happy to help anyone walk through that or what that might look like if you're interested.
So a second part of a workplace policy is to look at what you're doing for manager training. Again, your managers are your eyes and ears of what's going on in an organization. Provide training for them so that they know how to recognize some of the signs of domestic violence in their staff. Do they know what your policies are that apply to that issue? Do they know about confidentiality? Breaking confidentiality could be a lawsuit waiting to happen. So there's a lot of liabilities that you want to be paying attention to. Third part is employee assistance programs. Do you offer an EAP? If you do, or some other kind of counseling service, make sure you know what the limitations of that are and what they can provide. Oftentimes EAP counselors are licensed mental health therapists. Sometimes they've been in practice, sometimes they are only really trained to kind of guide people to resources. So know what your EAP provider really does. And even if they are trained mental health therapists, that doesn't mean they've been trained in domestic violence. Let me tell you, like, there are not very many people that are trained specifically in domestic violence. When I was in graduate school, there was not even a class on domestic violence. Nowadays, I hear from my younger staff that I hire that they do have classes, but often they're electives, so not always mandatory part of their graduate training. Is your EAP connected to local community domestic violence resources and agencies? Do they know about the Women's Community and Peaceful Solutions Counseling? So any type of referral can be very helpful. It can make a big difference for that employee, especially if it's the one doing the abuse, to take that first step. Okay, next part is talking about security. And again, this is going to be different depending on the resources that every business and company has. Is your security personnel trained in how to respond to domestic violence situations? Is your workplace secure from outside intruders? Do you make it a policy to escort victims or employees to their cars? Do you make it a policy to have people escorted through your building? One of the things that I'm acutely aware of at our agency, as a counseling agency, we're in the Grable Van Line buildings downtown, the old Yonkers department store, and it's big. And so we have big, huge hallways that go around to the back. I'll be eating lunch someday in the lunchroom, and I see somebody walk down the hallway, and I'm like, okay, that shouldn't be happening. And so I get up and say, excuse me, can I help you? We don't allow people unescorted in our building. Usually there's some reason, but then I train the staff. You cannot have people just wandering around. That is just bad policy. Do you have adequate lighting in parking areas? Oftentimes people don't think of that. Women think of that all the time, and I'm kind of chagrined at times when I've brought that to landlords' issues, that issue to a landlord, and they look at me and like, oh, is the lighting not working? It's like, yeah, that's a super important thing, to be able to have well lit to get to your car safely. Again, at our building, our parking spots were on the other side of a smoking area that was confined with a big, tall fence. And some of my employees are like, you know, it's really hard, just for the employees, when we leave at night and it's dark and we can't see our cars on the other side, to not know if that's going to be safe. So I explained that to the landlord, in addition to the fact that we work with a lot of women who have been victimized, either sexually or physically, and he immediately got it and took that fence down. So that was a very good landlord, that he's paying attention. Last one, do you have the capability to temporarily reassign internal phone numbers or extensions to protect victims? If she's trying to stay away from him, he can't get access to her. So if he doesn't have that phone extension, he can't get her.
Or another thing about the parking area, if you have specific parking, would it be possible for someone who identifies as a victim to have a special parking space?
Right.
That, so is there a place where they could have an enclosed parking space so that their perpetrator, who is likely stalking them to see where they are, wouldn't be able to see whether or not their vehicle was at the place of employment? So just some things to think about, if that's possible in your place of employment, to adjust the needs of what someone needs to make sure, because again, after someone leaves, it's pretty common in intimate relationships for the victim to be stalked by their partner.
Right.
They tend to follow them. They're losing control, and they're trying to keep control of them, and it's not uncommon for them to engage in stalking behaviors. So if there's a way that you could prevent vehicles from being seen, that could help protect someone.
And I think sometimes businesses might be feeling like, geez, this is a lot of work to do. Not sure that why do we have to accommodate this? You really need to think about this in terms of liability. We're going to talk a little bit later about the Family Medical Leave Act. We're going to talk about the Americans with Disability Act. If someone says they need an accommodation, they're a victim, you should treat that the same way as if someone's in a wheelchair and says, I need an accommodation to be able to do my job. Speaking of that, leave and benefit policies. Does your workplace offer leave or flexible schedules so that employees can go to court to testify, for example, or they need to go to counseling maybe weekly, or they need to be able to go to the shelter to be safe? And they should be able to do that without fear of losing their job. Temporary assignments are another option if employees need to leave the area for a period of time to stay safe. Anything you want to add to that? Want to talk that one?
Again, this is about raising awareness and understanding and education. It's a very powerful tool. So have you provided education to your employees, management team, leadership team, all folks that you work with on domestic violence and why it is everyone's business? Again, this is something that the women's community can provide for you free of charge. It is something that we provide to our community. Contact us and we set up a time that works for your team. We can come in and train on understanding domestic violence, how to recognize it, and all the things that that folks would have questions about. And brown bag seminars, newsletters, there's a variety of different ways that you can provide information and education to your employees. So something just to think about on a regular basis, to be providing information about identifying abuse.
And you need to consider it can't just be a one and done. Okay, we did that a couple years ago, so we're not going to do it again. It has to be an ongoing, semi-annual basis would be the best. Think about workplace policies for financial support. Does your workplace offer emergency funds or some type of support to employees in crisis? Could that be used for a victim? Your support can make a dramatic difference in the life of someone trying to escape domestic violence, whether it's enough money that could just tide them over for a first and last month's rent if they need to move to a different place, or to buy a used car, or a variety of different things. Community resources need support as well. So think about the nonprofits in our area, such as the Women's Community, Peaceful Solutions Counseling, the Neighbor's Place, the Salvation Army. All of those places don't have money falling from the skies to help them provide those services. So by providing your financial support to those resources, it in turn helps victims of domestic violence. Okay, working with abusers. This is a little bit tricky, I think, for people. Does your workplace domestic violence policy outline repercussions for employees who engage in acts of domestic violence during company time or using company property or resources? There needs to be a part of that in the policy. Interestingly, a lot of places of employment, when they start doing that, they find that it does make a big impact, because most abusers really don't want to lose their jobs, and so they're very good at knowing where they can cross the line and where they can't, and so they make sure they stand behind that line. When an employee perpetrates domestic violence either against a coworker or on company property or time, the employer should take disciplinary action. Referrals should be made to the EAP or appropriate community treatment programs such as Peaceful Solutions Counseling, SAFE program. We are the only certified abusers treatment program in Marathon County, and actually a lot of counties surrounding us don't have a treatment program, so we are the go-to place. A lot of times people think you have to be court ordered to attend the SAFE program. That is not true. We take voluntary people all the time. Do you want to talk about that?
There are some specific issues, and we're going to kind of go quickly through this because it gets very technical in the laws of medical leave. So there are state and federal laws with treatment to domestic violence, the ADA, the FMLA, you can Google that, actually would be the easiest way for you to find that information. Google family medical leave, domestic abuse, and it takes you right to the section that identifies that, as well as the ADA.
And OSHA's got, we saw some stuff on the OSHA website when we were putting this together. They've got good stuff. Okay, we are going to be able to email each of you the actual PowerPoint, because this next part is actual verbiage from the Family Violence, Task Force on Family Violence in Milwaukee, their policy, and you'll see where it says insert employer's name here. They do not mind that is shared, and so if you want to then use that to develop your own policy, you can. So I just want to read through this and kind of give you a flavor of it. And I'm going to use the Acme Corporation. Acme Corporation will not tolerate nor excuse conduct that constitutes workplace domestic violence. Acme considers the perpetration of domestic violence by an employee to constitute at a minimum intolerable, illegal, unethical, unacceptable conduct. See how strong that language is? It needs to be that strong. We are committed to identifying, assisting, and holding accountable employees who are or have been perpetrators of domestic violence or sexual assault. Employees found to have violated this policy will be subject to corrective or disciplinary action up to and including discharge. Any HR people in the audience are familiar with that last sentence? It's a very common and important one. This policy strictly prohibits the use of violence or threats of violence in the workplace. Additionally, any physical assault or threat made by an employee while on Acme time or premises during working hours or at any Acme-sponsored event is a serious violation of Acme policy. This policy applies not only to acts against other employees, but also to acts against all other persons, including intimate partners. That's an important sentence to have in there. Employees found to have violated this policy will be subject to corrective or disciplinary action up to and including discharge. Employees who are convicted of a crime as a result of domestic violence may be subject to corrective or disciplinary action up to and including discharge when such action affects the work performance of the employee or affects the normal operation of Acme Corporation. So it's covering both bases there. This policy is in place to discipline employees who use workplace telephones, computers, faxes, email, copiers, regular mail, electronic communication devices, or information systems, the internet, any company property, company resource, or privately owned property while on company time during the performance of company business or at client sites to harass others, including their intimate partners. So think about that all-inclusive list. Try and list as many things as you can think of so that there's no little wormholes that somebody can get through. This list is not intended to be all-inclusive of any method that can be used to violate this policy. Acme Corporation may investigate allegations of domestic violence, sexual assault, and/or stalking, where an employee is named as a defendant, whether a civil or criminal action, or if there is reason to believe an employee has committed such crimes at Acme Corporation work sites, but no formal action has taken place. So this is all very good, strong language. Upon completion of the investigation, whether the employee has been charged criminally or found liable civilly, Acme Corporation can take corrective action and discipline the employee, including placing the perpetrator on administrative leave, that should say on administrative leave without pay, or taking other disciplinary measures up to and including termination. Acme Corporation, through Human Resources, may also require that the perpetrator seek help at the Employee Assistance Program or attend and successfully complete a certified and approved Batters Intervention Program. Make sure it says certified and approved. Unfortunately, there are some places that do like a one-shot deal and go, oh, we've done domestic violence treatment of the abuser. We did 2 hours and we're done. No, Wisconsin has something called Wisconsin Batters Treatment Providers Association, the WBTPA. And that is the governing body for certification for treatment plans. We have to make programs. We have to make sure that we have a curriculum that is approved by them and that facilitators have appropriate training. So make sure you have that in there. Continued employment is contingent upon not committing any new offenses and obeying all conditions of any protective order, whether criminal or civil. Acme Corporation will maintain the perpetrator's confidentiality. So you need to maintain that as well, not just victim confidentiality. Do you want to talk about this?
So there are workplace safety plans to go through, and again, these are things that you with your leadership team and management teams can talk about what is capable, what you're able to do at your company, but also to make sure you are engaging and listening to the victims as to what their needs are. So you might encourage them, if they are on work time, if they have email or anything, to save that information. So this might be something that they're building a case, that you're holding a case also in the event that the perpetrator is under your employee. So we would have victims save any messages that they have. Again, parking priority, if there's a place that you can have victims have a safer parking, security measures, have the victims' phone calls screened, if that's something that your company can do and offer as a support. So, because oftentimes they have this pressure and they feel like they have to respond. So if your company has a policy that employees cannot use their cell phones while on company time, then if the perpetrator is trying to get through them through the business line, you might be able to kind of intervene there and prevent any of the contacts. And then relocate the victim's workplace if that's possible. Just, thinking in terms of things that might be possible that victims might need. There are a number, we're not going to read the whole list, you all can read that, but there are a variety of different things when you're going over with your leadership team on how you can help establish your policies and your protocols and what potential things you could put in place to help keep victims safe.
So assisting abusers in the workplace, we've talked about this earlier. You need to hold them accountable for the behavior, don't condone, minimize the abuse, or feed into the abuser's attempts to explain away the abuse. Because let me tell you, these guys are very good and very convincing. I have seen guys who really can convince you that they did nothing wrong and that the victim is the one who's crazy, or she's got a drinking problem, or she's so out there, she's bipolar, or she is sleeping with every guy in town, and so or she's so horribly violent to me. I mean, they are really convincing. So you've got to make sure that you're not buying into that. Let's see what else. As I said earlier, you can influence the abuser's behavior because they know they don't want to lose their job. So if they know if they're at risk of that, it's going to help keep them more in line. The key to assisting a batterer is being respectful. I've not done 33 years of working with men who are abusive to women by being disrespectful to them. They are human beings, like Jane said earlier. Oftentimes, they were raised in families where they saw domestic violence, or they themselves were abused as kids. They learn that, they become that, and that's who they are. If you were to meet my guys, you'd be like, and you didn't know they were in my group, you'd be like, well, they're nice guys. They are nice guys. They do bad behaviors. It doesn't mean that they are not to be respected as a human being and have a worth of a human being. Offer the abuser a referral to the EAP for legal, housing, substance abuse, or other resources. Do not refer them for individual counseling. Tons of research shows that individual counseling with abusers is not only ineffective, it's harmful. Oftentimes, well-meaning therapists don't know it, but they collude with the batterer. They fall into believing what he's telling them, and then before you know it, they're having a conversation about what's wrong with her and all the things that should be different for her. So marriage counseling also is not appropriate in domestic violence situations. It needs to be group therapy. Research upon research upon research shows that group therapy is the most effective at holding him accountable and helping him change those behaviors. Doesn't mean you can't send him to EAP for some of those resources, but for treatment, it needs to be a certified batterers treatment program, and that happens to be us at Peaceful Solutions.
And just one other kind of aside with that, with the substance abuse issue, is both victims and perpetrators will use substance abuse as an excuse. Oftentimes, victims will tell us how the only time there's violent episodes is when they've been drinking, and if they would just stop drinking, everything would be fine. And so what we know is if you have a person who uses power and control and also abuses substances, they have two problems. Mm-hmm. And they have to be treated both problems separately. Removing the alcohol use doesn't suddenly create someone who doesn't have power and control issues. They're two different things, so we don't let people use substance abuse as an excuse for their poor behavior.
Absolutely. All right, so we have a variety of frequently asked questions that are specific to workplace. What can I do if another employee reports suspicions that a coworker is a domestic abuse victim? So you've got an employee coming to you maybe as the manager. In a private meeting, inform the victim that you're worried about them, that you're concerned about him or her. Encourage them to come to you with the problem. Let them know that you're listening, like we talked about earlier, that you care, so that they can open up to you. Give them the referrals for services like we talked about. When not appropriate for you to contact the victim, you can provide the coworker with information and referrals to share with the one that they're concerned about. Again, talking about it, opening up, is letting the light of day at it is what's helpful.
What do I do if an employee shows me a protection order and we do not have security personnel or easily controlled facilities? So this is where you want to clarify with the petitioner of the restraining order, the victim who has a restraining order, that you need to make who you need to make aware of that restraining order. So ask them who they would like to know. Sometimes they would say, I want everyone to know in case anyone sees them, depending on where the place of employment is. So you work with the person who is a victim that has a protective order on who you need to notify and how you do that, and then to know that if the perpetrator violates a restraining order, police need to be called immediately. It is a must arrest.
Is there legal liability if my abuser's picture is posted in my workplace? So you can do that as long as there's a valid court order, no contact order, restraining order, which names the individual. It's recommended that you put that picture, though, only posted in areas where it's kind of a need-to-know basis. So it should be by the front receptionist. It should be by the security personnel. It doesn't have to be all through the entire building.
As the employer, I really don't want to get involved in this problem because there may just be on the home front. It's not really my issue. If everything is okay at work, do I need to do anything? Everything is not okay at work if you have someone in your employee who is a victim of abuse. It's not okay. So remember how costly domestic violence is. Remember that this is costing your company time when that person is unable to function effectively because of the trauma and the abuse that they're living in. And remember how it can affect you in tragic ways that we don't want to think about, as our coworkers experienced on March 22nd. We need to talk about it. It is a concern because it comes from the home and it can manifest itself at your place of employment.
Next question, I have an employee whose performance is not satisfactory. She has the signs and symptoms of domestic abuse, but has never disclosed the abuse. I believe this abuse may be a contributing factor to her work performance. What should I do? Answer, again, talk with the employee privately. Let her know your concerns about her work performance and abuse at home. Let her know the ways in which the company can work with her. Let her know you're on her side, that you're here to help her, not that you're there to punish her or that you're going to fire her. And again, provide referrals for her for services in the community for whatever she thinks that she needs at that time.
I know one of my employees is in an abusive situation. Can I force this employee to get counseling? How many of you like to be told what to do? We really can't enforce our employees to do anything, but what we can do is express our concern for them. If it is a work performance problem, of course, you're going to follow your usual protocols of what you do when an employee has a problem with their work performance. In a situation where they're in an abusive relationship and that is affecting their employment, I think you be honest about that and offer the concern. I want to help you figure this out so that we can make you a successful employee here. What can we do to help you do that? Would you consider going to counseling? Would you consider speaking with an advocate? Give them the space to make those choices and let them know you're concerned about them. But clearly, no one likes to be told what to do, and if you force someone into a corner, they're going to fight back.
Question, I've heard that some men might be in an abusive relationship or situation. Are the signs and symptoms the same? So as I said earlier, it's a very small population that we find of men being abused by women, but keep in mind it could be men being abused by men if they are in a homosexual relationship or transgender relationship, either way. It's about 2 to 5% of abuse is women against men. So it's much more rare that you're going to see that, but it can occur. Men are usually not injured as severely in terms of physical force because women aren't as strong as men. We don't have testosterone in our bodies. We don't have the upper body strength. However, the equalizer to that is a weapon. And so if a woman is using a knife or a gun or some other sort of weapon, she can do damage to that man. Usually the psychological symptoms are going to be the same in terms of someone who's being abused. That trauma brain that we talked about, maybe having a difficult time making decisions. You're seeing things that are different about him than what it used to be. It could be a variety of things, and domestic violence could be one of them.
An employee has acknowledged her partner is abusive, but has requested no interference, even though the partner has been loitering in our lobby to spy on her. So the victim is afraid, their partner's showing up, but they say, please don't do anything, it's just going to make it worse. Your responsibility is to the safety of all of your employees of your company, to your policies, and so you need to enforce with that victim, I have to enforce our company policy. If anyone were loitering here, we would not allow that. That is our policy. It doesn't matter that this is your partner. It matters that someone is violating our company policies and we have to ask them to leave.
This is a frequent question we get. Does an abusive victim fall into any of the legal protection areas such as Family Medical Leave Act? So for those of you that don't know, the Family Medical Leave Act is a federal law which mandates up to 12 weeks of leave from work without that person losing their job to attend to some sort of a family medical condition or issue. So it includes serious medical conditions such as illness, injury, impairment, or a physical or medical condition that involves inpatient treatment or ongoing outpatient treatment by a healthcare professional. So mental health professionals are healthcare professionals. It's not just the medical, it can also be emotional. In some situations, victims of domestic violence may fall under the FMLA guidelines. It is strongly recommended that you have your own legal counsel review your policies and see if you think that the domestic violence policy you have and procedures, if they pertain to the FMLA. We're not going to dictate that for you. You need to have legal counsel.
We're going to briefly talk about restraining orders in the event that you have someone in your employee who has a restraining order. So the process is a two-part process. So victims who are asking for court orders of protection that would mandate one person stay away from that individual, their place of employment, or any place that they occupy, they fill out that paperwork. And then after the paperwork is filled, the initial court commissioner or judge, depending on where you are, reviews it. If they sign it, there is a temporary restraining order in place for up to 14 days until the petitioner and the respondent, which is a victim and perpetrator, but in restraining orders, that's the language. Petitioner is the victim, respondent is the perpetrator. There's a court hearing in which they appear, they argue their case, and then the judge determines whether or not an injunction is granted. An injunction can be up to 4 years.
So an injunction and a restraining order, those are used interchangeably, those terms, correct?
They're separate things.
They are separate.
They are separate things. So a restraining order in the state of Wisconsin language is a TRO. It's a temporary restraining order, which means that is the piece of paper that is in effect only after the perpetrator has been served. So if the perpetrator has not received service, there is no restraining order in place. So until they receive the paper that says you cannot have contact with this individual, their place of employment, or any place they occupy, there's no restraining order in place. There can be no recourse for that. So we work with a lot of people who try to avoid service so that they can never have the restraining order against them. So they avoid any time showing up where there might be someone who could get their paperwork. So we have a lot of different creative ways we work around that to try to find people. Yes?
After somebody gets arrested for domestic violence, most of the time there's like a court order as part of bail. You're not allowed to have contact with the victim. Is that the same thing as a restraining order?
It is not.
Is that different?
It is different. So the court order after a domestic abuse arrest, there are a few different no contact orders that are in place. After an arrest, there's a 72-hour no contact that automatically goes into play in the state of Wisconsin, which says the perpetrator, the arrested party, cannot for 72 hours have any contact with the victim. That is automatically in place at the point of arrest. Depending on the scenario, when there's an initial appearance, the prosecutor may request a non-waivable no contact, which would mean that the perpetrator cannot have contact with the victim at any time. The victim may request that. In very serious situations, prosecutors will try to get a non-waivable no contact because they know many times victims will waive those. So victims will show up at an initial appearance and say, I want contact. And judges will listen to that. And there's a whole lot of reasons why. A lot of times there's fear-based there, and victims are afraid that if they don't show up and say, I want to have contact, that they will be in more trouble later, that the abuse will escalate. So sometimes prosecutors that are very familiar with situations may request a non-waivable no contact, and then the victim doesn't have any choice. So there are a few different ways that the court can order a no contact after an arrest. A restraining order does not ever have to involve the criminal process in any way. Restraining orders are a civil case. That's how they start out, with criminal consequences. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic. You can have a restraining order and never have your partner has been arrested in the history of your relationship. There does not have to be an arrest for a restraining order to be granted and in place. So they're separate things. The no contacts ordered by the court after an arrest are one avenue, but for victims who, for whatever reason, never want to call the police, but they want protection, they can file a civil order to get a restraining order. So the injunction is after they appear in court, and that is the final order. So once someone is served with a temporary restraining order, they are told what date they need to appear in court. The two parties go to court, they argue it out. Judge determines that there is enough evidence that this person needs to stay away. They file an injunction, and that is good forever. If the respondent doesn't, not forever, for up to 4 years. Sometimes it can be extended depending on situations.
There's the 10-year caveat too.
If it's extreme situations, and if a victim requests and can say, these are the reasons why I need 10 years, that's possible. Average is 4 years. If the respondent doesn't show up to the restraining order hearing, it's automatically granted. They have been determined that they have constructive knowledge that there's a restraining order in place. If they don't want to argue against it, it is automatically granted. So if they don't show up, an injunction is in place, end of story. So then there's an injunction, and the respondent says, I didn't even know, I wasn't at the court. Nope, too bad. You had knowledge, you knew that this was happening, you didn't show up, the injunction is in place whether or not you appeared in court.
And that's why the service has to be done by either the sheriff's department or a private process service, so they can prove to the court this person was given the document, like they hand it to him.
So the temporary order is just what is initially done before they appear in court in person. That's a TRO, and then the injunction is the actual protective order that is the long-term order.
We covered this.
So again, up to 4 years, and there are a few different kinds of restraining orders. The thing that's important that we want people to understand about restraining orders, I think this is the next slide, they might not actually be safest for victims. So several years ago, domestic abuse restraining orders had an added provision that anyone who has a domestic abuse injunction against them cannot possess a firearm. So in our culture, people are very tied to their firearms, hunting purposes and all the other purposes that people have firearms. They say, fine, you can get a restraining order, but if you try to take my guns away, then we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So the gun provision has actually kind of made it more difficult for some people to get a domestic abuse restraining order. So it's something you really want people to think about. Telling someone to get a restraining order might not be the best advice. Again, you can contact the women's community. We can walk you through all of those things. Victims can call us. We can talk to them about all of those possibilities, because having guns removed can sometimes escalate the perpetrator. Because of that, you can get a harassment restraining order, which does not have an automatic provision. So many victims of domestic abuse know that if they get a domestic abuse order, which requires surrender of firearms, that's going to escalate the violence. So they request a harassment order so that the guns are not part of that. Harassment orders do not require gun surrender. It's important for people to understand that. People say it's just a piece of paper, it doesn't really keep people safe, and for some perpetrators that is absolutely true. But for many it's quite effective. For people who really want to stay under the radar, they want to stay in that secret manipulation that no one knows that they're doing it, restraining orders can be very effective, and they abide by them. So it's not ever a guarantee, but if you are talking to someone, if someone has a restraining order, know that if the individual who is the respondent, the perpetrator, comes to your place of employment, you have a restraining order that that person cannot be there, anyone can call the police to report that violation. It doesn't have to be the petitioner.
On that same note, in terms of, that's the civil part. In the criminal part, oftentimes we have people who are court ordered to our program and they have made a plea agreement with the district attorney and they want to get it pled down to a lesser charge because they don't want the firearms taken away. So a lot of times we'll see the behavior maybe is more severe than what the charge looks like, because it might be a misdemeanor charge when in essence the behavior that they did towards their partner really constitutes a felony, but they've done a little plea negotiations. It kind of bothers me. On the other hand, I'm like, at least we got his butt in the chair. You know, at least we've got him in therapy and we can see if we can do some things to help the victim by helping him change his behavior.
So one of the things that this can get really sticky is if you have the two people, both the respondent and petitioner, both employed at your company.
Right.
And they work in the same department. How do you handle that? So the best thing to do is sit down with the victim and safety plan how they would like that handled. And then because the respondent is court ordered, you can follow the court order and say, because of this, you need to change your work habits and they need to accommodate the protection of the victim.
Speaking of protection, we talked last time about lethality. I just want to go over this again because I want everyone to have a heightened awareness about what the factors are of how lethal someone is, as in how likely is it that this person is going to kill another person. This is based off of Barbara Hart's work from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. These are not in an order of one more important than 2, 3, 6. This is just the different factors. Threats of homicide or suicide. Anytime there is a threat that he's going to kill himself, oftentimes what he's really thinking of doing is killing her first and then killing himself. We see those homicide, suicides very often in domestic violence, intimate partner relationships. A lot of times people and victims I've talked to kind of blow that off and go, oh, yeah, he's threatened that, but he doesn't mean that. I'm very firm. Whenever someone says that to me, it's like, do not take that lightly. A threat is a very serious thing. Research shows when people threaten that, they typically do follow through on that. Second, fantasies of homicide or suicide. Research shows that when batterers are feeling in that escalation phase, feeling scared about losing their partner, feeling more inadequate, more insecure, that they're more likely to have fantasies about committing homicide or suicide. Again, sometimes people think that, oh, if they're just thinking about it, it's just a fantasy, it's not going to really happen. Take that seriously if you know that that person's been having fantasies about that. Weapons. Anyone who has access to weapons, who's really comfortable with weapons, who uses weapons a lot, that automatically, in our lethality assessment, when we screen for guys coming to the program, that always kicks them up a notch or two. Especially when I have people who've been in armed services, and if they've been in special forces, I get even more nervous because they really know their way around a weapon of many different sorts, and it makes them more lethal. And they've been trained to use that and to kill, and without really, thinking about the emotional part of that. Fourth one is ownership of the battered partner, feeling like I own her. It's kind of like the old adage of, if I can't have her, nobody's going to have her. And that's typically when we see men kill their intimate partner. She's leaving him, she's divorcing him, or maybe they weren't married, but she's left him and she's now with another partner. That escalates it to the point that he feels like, I've lost control totally. I have no control over her anymore. I can't bear the thought of her with someone else, so I'm going to kill her. And sometimes he kills her and kills the new partner. I'm sure you've seen those in the news. Or kills her, the new partner, and himself. I've seen that oftentimes, unfortunately. Centrality of the partner means she's central to his life. So many people think that the guys coming to my program are very independent, confident, strong, and have all the answers. They're actually the opposite. Most of the men in my program are very dependent on their partners. They don't look that way. They try to pretend the opposite, but like she makes the appointments for him. Like, I can't tell you the number of times that a partner calls and schedules his intake assessment. And I'm on the phone, and I can hear him in the background, like telling her what to say. Like, is he in the room with you? Yes. I said, tell you what, put him on the phone. Like, he's a big boy. He's going to make his own appointment. We're not going to have you be his mommy. So many of these men do not function well. To be very frank, sometimes I wonder how they even get to their jobs and do their jobs, because she's taking care of so many things. So think about it again. If his life centers around her, and now he has the risk of that being gone, that is so scary that he's then thinking, I'm just going to kill her or kill her and myself. Separation violence, which we talked about, her leaving, her being separated from him, that increases his thoughts of wanting to kill. Depression is a very big indicator with domestic violence, homicide, and suicide. A lot of research has shown that as that depression rises, he feels like there is no way out, there isn't a way to deal with this, and so a way out is to kill himself, but also to kill her, which I know doesn't make sense, but that's what it is. Access to the victim and/or to family members, meaning law enforcement and people involved need to think about, if you know that there's a highly volatile situation, what access does he have to her? What access does he have to the children? And do what you can to try to prevent him from having access. Years ago, probably 20 years ago, we had a man in our program by the name of Kevin Bronk, who went on to kill his wife with a knife, stabbed her to death, and then stabbed himself to death. I think it was 2 days prior to that Marathon County Department of Social Services had taken the kids out of the home because they knew that there was some volatility. Obviously, the woman had the right to decide whether or not she was staying or not. I know in my heart of hearts that if those kids had been in that house, they would have been killed as well. So you need to think about, how do we keep those kids safe? How do we keep that victim safe? If he can't find her, he can't kill her. Number 9, repeated outreach to law enforcement. A lot of homicides, when we do a homicide review, we look back at that and you can see that there was escalation, escalation, escalation. Kind of like that violence cycle, that cycle of violence that I showed you. Repeated calls to law enforcement. Law enforcement has been trained really well to understand that that is a lethality factor, that they need to be hyper vigilant about what's going on in that situation. As opposed to 35, 40 years ago, when my friends who were cops then said, we were trained like, it's like the Saturday night fights. We keep going back to the Joneses' house time after time after time, and they kind of thought like it was no big deal. Now they realize it's a huge deal, and to pay attention when there's a lot of involvement. And number 10, escalation of bad or risk, as in, is he escalating the amount of violence, the frequency of violence, the lethalness of the violence, as well as, is he escalating doing things in public? Usually batters try to do things behind closed doors to keep that a secret. Is he doing it now in front of the kids and doesn't care? Is he doing things out in public that other people see, their friends, their relatives, coworkers? That makes me very, very nervous whenever I see that going on. That increases the lethality. Anything you want to add to any of those? Nope. Ooh, we're doing good on time. Questions? We got about 15 minutes left. Anyone have any questions that you would like to ask? No? Okay. Tell you what, here is our contact information at the end, as well as some additional resources. Please feel to reach out to either Jane or I or our staff if you have further questions that you think of later. We're more than happy to help you with any of these aspects.
And I think one of the things we really, again, wanted to reiterate and have you take away is talking about this and bringing this out of secrecy is critically important. You have the ability to change the lives of people who are experiencing abuse in your place of employment by listening to what they need and creating policies that help support keeping victims safe. So thank you for bringing it out of the darkness.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.